We have all the original documentation and pictures from when it was delivered. And it's been restored to exactly as she took possession of it. 100 years ago, wealthy socialites traveled around in their own private railroad cars like this. This was the equivalent of a private jet in those days. This was the most luxurious form of travel. You could go anywhere that the passenger railroad service went by paying to be at the end of a train. And back in those days, railroad stations were frequently luxury destinations in the big cities where all the best, members of society showed up with their private passenger cars, met guests, and traveled wherever they wanted to go. This particular car, between 1912 and 1929, Clara Baldwin Stocker took across the U.S. and Canada many times. And she had a yacht in Bar Harbor, Maine, and she would occasionally take a small entourage across the country, then go out on a cruise on her beautiful 200-something foot yacht, and then return, stopping in all the most popular cities and destinations along the way. So this was the way it was done for wealthy people back in the early days. This car is just beautiful, custom made with the wood she specified, the leaded glass, and the chandeliers and everything are exactly the way it was. This is the reception area and the dining area. Then there's her stateroom just past that. Beyond that are two guest staterooms. And in the front of the car are the servants' quarters, where they had a porter and a cook that traveled with them at all times. They took care of all the cooking and cleaning and everything that was needed. A train pulled by a steam locomotive like this, or an earlier version perhaps, they stopped frequently, at least every hour or so, to take on more fuel, like coal and water. So there was always time and arrangements to take on more supplies. So they didn't have air conditioning in those days, but they did have evaporative air cooling, like a swamp cooler they call it nowadays. They had ice boxes, they had a boiler for hot water, and they had their own generator for electricity. So they could be at the back of the train and not depend on the train's electric power to provide all the luxury in here. She even had a player piano called a pianola made to match this car out of the same wood that the car was made out of. Then up front there's that steam locomotive. That locomotive is from a slightly newer era than this car. This is called a heavyweight passenger car. And these guys were made up until around the 1930s, when they decided to make them lighter and more efficient. But this was made with all steel siding and everything. This was a very heavy car. It rode quite well because of that. It was a smooth ride. But back in those days, there were only heavyweight passenger cars like this, all made by the Pullman company. And nowadays, they get much lighter, because of fuel concerns. But all the wealthy people had cars like this back in those days. Even Clara Baldwin Stocker's sister, Anita Baldwin, she had a car very similar to this. And those girls, they're the daughters of Lucky Baldwin. I don't know if I mentioned that. Lucky Baldwin was the owner of all the land that's now San Gabriel Valley, and founder of Santa Anita Racetrack, and the Los Angeles County Arboretum was actually Lucky Baldwin's estate and home. It's still in there. And these were his daughters who lived this life, but they were prominent Los Angeles socialites. Anyway, up front, that locomotive is a different story. That's a relatively modern locomotive, but it still is steam-powered, and it was fed by coal, stoker, and it ran for millions of miles before it was retired. Well, in the late 90s, it was in danger of being scrapped, just like this passenger car. They had been derelict and out in the weather for years. And so then they finally, the Nethercutts heard about it. They obtained this car, knowing its history, because it's a famous car. And the locomotive up front, which was in danger of being scrapped, they brought them out here and rebuilt them on this spot. The same people who rebuilt all of these cars.